And if it's working, which it looks like it is, it's going to tell me that we're on Facebook. Good afternoon, early evening, Wednesday, May 13th, still. And we've got another interview to do. As you guys know, early voting starts today, and the primaries here in the state of Iowa. If you're looking to not get texts, not get mail, not get calls, not get people knocking on your door, vote if your mind is made up. If you still have some thinking to do, I certainly understand it. Um, just know you're going to endure a few more contacts, but maybe, you don't have a whole lot going on and you like it talking to people about politics and that's your thing. So today, this afternoon, we are being joined by Representative Brian Lohse. He is an incumbent seeking another term in Iowa House District 45. First thing I want to do is share the screen so that you guys can see what District 45 is. And just to make sure everybody knows, both candidates were invited to appear on this for a debate. They both gave me some dates. None of those dates worked. Today finally worked. And one of the candidates, Austin Stubbs, said at this point of the campaign he wasn't interested in doing this. So we are having Representative Lohse on to talk about his campaign and candidacy. Representative Lohse, thanks for joining us. It looks like, and you correct me if I'm wrong, House District 45 encompasses Bondurant, Polk City, Alleman, Elkhart, Mitchellville, Runnels, part of Carlisle, maybe?
Yeah, some incorporated parts of Carlisle. Really, the only thing down in that where the cursor is a little community called Avon Lake, which actually has a fascinating history, but we don't have time to go into that. But also included is half of Sheldall and the eastern portions of Granger. So
Okay.
it is people are quite shocked when they from in the Iowa House just how large that district is and how much land it encompasses.
Well, when you guys get creative with redistricting, some of those districts, especially down near around Des Moines, can get pretty
Right.
unique, I guess is what we'll call them.
Yeah, and to be fair, it's 30,000 people. It is a large area, but there's a lot of farmland and a lot of corn that is encompassed in that. So it's not like
Yeah.
it's wall to wall people.
So House District 45, for those who aren't familiar, 9,340 registered Republicans, 5,124 Democrats, and 7,914 no party registered voters. And that makes up about 22,000 some. Don't check my math because I'm sure it's not exact. But I think based on the numbers, you won in 2024 with 64.6%. Pretty safe Republican seat. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that is, I believe it is most of the independents, I believe. And I will say also, back in 2024, the number of independents was significantly smaller as well. So that number has grown. The Democrat number has not fallen off. It is the Republican side of that. There are a number of people that have gone and registered as independents just in the last couple of years.
Interesting. This is the first time Representative Lohse is at a primary. He's held this seat since I want to say 2019, but I could be
Right.
way off.
Right.
Uh,
Yep.
Sometimes I wish I didn't know everything that I think I know about about this. But tell us a little bit about how you got into office because it is a little unique with this being your first primary.
It seems like anytime I've held public office, it's been a little unique. Specifically to this race in 2018, my representative was Zach Nunn, representing East Polk County, the east side of that map. Uh, in August, literally the first day or two of the Iowa State Fair, Zach announced his run for the state Senate seat, leaving that seat open. Um, and his good friend and who's now running for Senate, Wes Enos, called me and said, "Can we meet for breakfast?" And a couple of days later, I did. I had fully intended him to ask if I would consider running. So in because he had done so before when Zach was being considered for lieutenant governor, and when I was on when we were both on city council, and it's over those couple of days in between talking about it with my wife and the kids, and while we're sitting at the Iowa State Fair, I'm like, this is something that I'm anticipating in running. I hadn't, certainly not what I had ever thought I would do, but, um, you know, we knew that it was going to be a short race. It was going to be a time intensive, money intensive to overcome a good friend of mine, but also an opponent who had been doing that for almost a year, campaigning the Democrat. Um, we had the time, we had the resources, and it seemed like the thing that I wanted to do in order to just go to the next level of representing East Polk County.
So, as all good decisions, um, it was one that originated or was finalized perhaps at the Iowa State Fair.
Yeah, probably over a corn dog, I'm sure.
All right. So because you're an incumbent, like I can't just cheat off the same script that I've used for the first 8 or 10 of these. But tell us a little bit about why you've decided to run for another term in the Iowa House.
It really comes down to is I have unfinished business. Just a couple days after session ended, I went through my list of bills that and my priorities that I had filed in prior years and things that I've been trying to accomplish. And I realized there were still things that I needed to do, and even obviously when I announced last fall, it really comes down to there's things that I want to do, and since 2021 adoption, and moving the needle on adoption and make it more affordable and accessible, I still have work to do in that. I've accomplished a great deal, but there's still more work to do on that. Human trafficking, an issue that is quite frankly I'm driven. Um, by my daughter, who this is one of her big passions, and you know the bill was filed last year and it passed the Iowa Senate or this year. Finally, is going to the governor. It's House File 1036 that deals with victims and vastly improves the situation for victims. Um, we need to work along with Mark Thompson. I need to work along with Mark Thompson to come up with solutions that are going to look at the supply side of things, the perpetrators, and really do something big there. That is an unfinished piece of business. And then, especially since I've been the judicial systems or justice systems budget chair, legal deserts, indigent defense, our constitutional obligation to provide attorneys to those that can't afford one. That is still a area where I have work to do. I had hoped when I took that position in the budget chair that I could get the indigent defense rate to $100. I'm ever so close, and that's one of those things that I really want to try to get to before I'm done.
All right. So, it's interesting every time I start out and I ask this question, I always wonder, or I always anticipate not getting much of a response, but I might get one from you. So I'm excited to ask this one. Republicans full control the
Mhm.
last decade. Um, is there one thing in particular that you can think of that the Republican legislature and Republican governor have passed in the last 10 years that you think, gee, shucks, maybe we shouldn't have done that?
Well, I could probably think of a few, but you know, one of the things that worries me, and one of the reasons I voted about the bill was the ES against the bill was the ESAs, and I think we're seeing that my concern start to come to fruition. One of the things that was my biggest concern was that when government starts giving money, strings will come. And this year, the Iowa House of Representatives, in a bill proposed by the Republicans, is was a bill that said that if a private educational institution took state money, then they had to do certain things. And now, immediately when I said that to Bobby Kaufman in his office, and he goes, "Yeah, what's your point?" And I go, "ESAs," and he goes, "Oh yeah." And during the discussion about that bill, that was the big thing that those that eventually opposed that bill, and it was about private colleges and the
Right.
receipt of scholarship money. But we were saying, if you're going to do that, you have to get rid of your DEI offices. All fine and good. I mean, I understand that, but right at this point, we're setting a precedent of, okay, if you're going to take money for uh, college or for your school, private Christian school, then we're going to put strings on that. And even even some of the Republican governor, what Randy Feenstra said already. Um, Something that Zach Lane said yesterday on a WHO commercial. I'm not sure exactly what all he was saying um, about audits, if that auditing the schools or if that's just auditing the whole program. But I graduated from Faith Baptist Bible College, Bible College, Great Faith Baptist Christian School um, in Sterling, Illinois in 1987. And those were the conversations we had around
Hmm.
my dinner table. My mom was the teacher out there. My dad, was the whole conversation around ESAs and taking government money. They don't want their hands tied, and I don't want their hands tied. And I think that's the one big thing that I'm hoping we don't come to regret is that we started down that road. I hope Christian schools don't come to that realization at some point that maybe this is something we didn't want to do. That was the conversation we literally had around our kitchen table many times when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Is we don't want in the end it'd be wonderful if the Christian school got more money, um, but at the same time we didn't want it to be able to be hampered in how they taught the subjects they were teaching.
Right. The strings that would potentially be attached to those dollars.
Yeah.
Is there, we'll pivot back to ESAs, I'm sure. Is there something, and you already talked about a few of your priorities that you still want to get addressed here before you leave the legislature. Anything that you can think of that stands out in the last 10 years of full Republican control, and you look back and you say, how have we not addressed this? How have we not gotten this across the finish line and signed by the governor?
Um, I think with with the pipelines, I think that is something that we should have and could have come to reasonable steps to reform that process. No one wants to use eminent domain. I was on city council. Like I said, I think I was on city council for 8 years. Um, no one ever wants to use eminent domain. Mid American, who can use it as well through the IUC process and Alliant, no city wants to use it. It's supposed to be of a last resort. And I think one of the things, at the least, we could have done and should have been doing is really looking at that process hard to reform the process under the Iowa Utilities Commission in order to ensure that eminent domain is it's already the tool of last resort, but let's make it even harder. Let's make that process a process that what needs to get accomplished gets accomplished without even being a question of need, and it's really reserved for the very last resort. So, and that didn't come out quite as I wanted it to, but it's hard to
No,
express.
that's fine.
But
I mean,
yeah.
you can kind of expand on that because the voting record on some of those bills that you guys have had that have dealt with eminent domain, when you look at it, some of the private property rights advocates may say um, they wish you had voted the other way. So, talk a little bit about what your solution to that issue then would be.
Yeah, and I just to say, most of my votes in that really come down to two things. Number one, Well, really one thing, I believe in the Constitution and at the end. And even if I agree with some of the concepts, if it violates the Constitution, I can't vote for it. I've taken an oath in front of the legislature. I've taken an oath as an attorney to uphold the Constitution. Some of the way we're going about some of those bills, in my opinion, violate the Constitution, and I can't support it. But the IUC process right now, the way it's set up, hamstrings a utility, and this is a one question that we have to also address as part of this reform, is which which companies are going to fall under that regulation. A Mid-American for electric and gas, true utilities, Alliant, obviously, electric, gas. Um, it's the Iowa Utilities Commission. Is Summit carbon capture a utility? I think that's one of the things we have to look at is how, which companies are really going to fall under this process and thus then be able to use eminent domain. That's one big reform we need to take a look at. Um, I think you have a hard time, at least I do, really saying that carbon capture is a utility in the way that electric is. I could probably make that case for broadband pretty easily, but it's hard to make that case. Um, should carbon capture be even included under IUC regulation? And then the process about going about informing landowners and providing them education and being able to ensuring that the corridor, and I think that's where the Senate was widening that is certainly needs to be part of that discussion, but not the only part. If you can make it so that people understand, what's happening in a much better and more transparent way, and I think the current IUC regulations and the process somewhat hamper that the company from doing that. So it's we always talk about transparency in government, and that's a good thing, and that needs to be better done within the IUC process.
Yep. So then I think House File 639 was probably the bill that got the most attention because of all of the strategic maneuvering that was done for that to get to the governor's
Remind me
desk.
which.
That
Yeah,
was the big eminent domain reform that the senators held up their votes on the budget in order to force a vote
last year.
on. Yep. They
Yeah,
voted on it, signed it, governor vetoed it, all that stuff
yeah.
happened. But
And if
anyway,
I
so all
recall
these,
correctly,
but my question is, um, you've voted multiple times against some of these bills. So could you tell me or tell the viewers, um, like what kind of a bill would you propose? Would you sponsor that really addresses this to balance those private property rights with the constitutionality of some of these bills that you weren't comfortable voting for?
right? Well, and first of all, and from a constitutionality standpoint, much of my problem with those bills was it just cut off eminent domain use by Summit at this point, and they'd already started down the process, and they were using the regulations, and I explained this way to a constituent at the door the other day. If I if Jacob, you have a shed in your backyard and your local government says, okay, no, people can't have sheds in their backyard anymore. They would need to grandfather you in, or else that is in itself a taking. That's a use of eminent domain. That, in my opinion, is what was happening with that particular bill. So first, if you're already running down the process and we change the regulations, someone who's already using that process needs to be allowed to continue. Otherwise, that is a taking of itself. They need to be grandfathered in, as we like to say. But again, I think the process where I would like to see the reform, and if I were to be writing the bill, it would be better transparency and better access to landowners to give them the information, all of the information as soon as possible. Without having, if they change the plan a little bit, if they have to alter things a little bit, without having to go back through the process. starting over, um, better transparency, um, allowing them to negotiate a little bit more transparently as well. I think there is a problem in that regard. Obviously, the corridor. Let's avoid those people that really don't want to do it, and or have that line through that. But then we also, in the end, we have to apply that to every single entity, not just carbon capture. Alliant, Mid American, everyone that is subject to that needs to have that process has to be applied to them.
So if it's a bill that just says no eminent domain for carbon capture pipelines, you're not necessarily comfortable with that because it wouldn't apply to everybody and it's interrupting it in the middle of what's already been started. Is that fair?
Yeah, yeah. I think there is that taking type of thing, but also if it's not applied to everyone, then there's an equal protection issue. So, but I
Okay.
also get back to is why is carbon capture even regulated by the IUC? So, and if they're not, then they wouldn't even have the right to eminent domain.
Right. It's
Mhm.
probably worth pointing out if people didn't already know you are a lawyer.
Well, yes, yeah. Hmm.
Yeah. And I did watch every episode of The Good Wife, but not a lawyer
We
by
did too.
training.
Yeah.
Just so a lot of I think just knowing that I think will help people understand kind of the perspective, whether they agree with it or not. I think it'll help them understand the perspective from which
Mhm.
you're coming. Um, I skipped past this one and I shouldn't have. Um, there's a couple of them that I want to get into. First, tell me, in your opinion, the difference between a Republican and a conservative. And then, of course, you have the Trump populist, you have constitutional conservative, establishment Republicans. We're, what's your understanding or definition of the difference between a Republican and a conservative? And where do you think you are on that spectrum?
Well, I would hope all Republicans are conservative. In my mind, I've never really sat down to think too much about all these little nuances. It's kind of like music. You have all these, alt country, alt rock, all this sub genre stuff. And I'm like, you know, good music's good music. And do you like it or not? And so all those types of things. To me, a conservative, though, is someone, who believes in limited government, who believes that government cannot solve all of your problems, who believes that you should be very fiscally responsible with money,
Mhm.
who believes that um, we cannot, as the government, cannot replace, even if we disagree with someone's individual decisions, as long as it's not really hurting someone else. Um, that's not our problem to change and to regulate. Um, so, you know, I consider myself, if we're going to put a label on it, a constitutional conservative. I Reagan conservative. I grew up in Dixon, Illinois, not in Dixon, but just south of Dixon. It was my hometown. My hometown was Amboy, and the county seat was Dixon. I practiced law in Dixon. It was an integral part of my life. Went to church there. Um, at a time, and I was what 12, I think, when Reagan became president, and or would be 12, and so it was one of those, and obviously during my formative years, Reagan to me is I got back there quite a bit over the last couple of years, visiting my parents as they were aging, and um, just being reminded of what he stood for,
Mhm.
Judeo-Christian morality, limited government, but also the realization and the need to reach across the aisle, and to be respectful of your opponent. Um, I was on a cruise this past fall with my wife, and we took a moment to sit down and watch the Reagan movie for the first time.
Hmm.
Now I annoyed the crap out of her a little bit because every time they had flashbacks of Dixon, I'm like, that's not really Dixon. That's Dixon. That's not really, so. Um, but it really reminded me of how passionate he was about, you know, limited government and doing the right thing. And that was something that, and that movie in part was just watching that reaffirmed that, I really wanted to run again. And carry those types of principles, continue to carry those types of principles.
All right. So now we'll kind of get issue specific, even though we already did that with the pipeline and worked our way backwards. We'll get issue specific here. This one, I'm anxious to hear your perspective as a lawyer,
Hmm.
because I think the Constitution says one thing and I think Iowa code may say another. Should Iowa legislators be required to live in their district beyond just the 60 days before the general election that they are right now? It seems a little silly that you can represent a district in which you do not live.
Um, well, I agree. I mean, are you saying from a federal standpoint or from just the Iowa
Let's
legislature?
just do just the federal stuff. They've got all kinds of issues
Yeah.
they got to fix. So let's kind of control what we can control and just say that if you want to be an Iowa House member, you have to actually live in that Iowa House district throughout your term.
Oh yeah, I firmly believe that. Now, the code I believe says you got to live there 60 days before the general election, and I guess I'd like to do two things with that code section. Number one, say you have to live there within maybe 60 days after the general election. I, to me, it says a little bit about what if we lose and you've spent all
Right.
this money uprooting your family and moving? Um, so I'd like to have a little grace after the election in order to get moved, and some opportunity. Because again, um, what if you lose? So,
Right.
but I think we need to put more teeth in it. And I'm not sure exactly how, but if you are going to represent a district, you need to live there. And I guess I can't really put in you have to live there for a certain period of time beforehand. I mean, that doesn't seem quite right. But you know, if you're going to properly represent your district, you need to know your district, and the only way to do that is to live there. So I think that process and that code section does need updated, and we need to take a hard, long look at it. I will say Republicans have not lived in the district. Democrats have not lived in the district. Everyone knows this. I think this is why it probably doesn't ever get changed.
Yeah. Well, it's just anytime you have the legislature exempting themselves from certain laws, good luck getting them to unexempt themselves from those
Um,
laws.
I would agree. So,
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about it's early voting starts today, so let's just get this one out of the way. Iowa has very good election integrity laws. I think everybody agrees on that. But again, I think we're comparing that to um, some blue states, Minnesota, Illinois, some of the other states around us. Is there anything that you think should be done to even make it better? Like, for example, to me, I think it's crazy that we do all this mail-in voting when, like, if you want to vote early, that's fine. That just go do it in person. Like, unless you're in the military, a college student, you're in a nursing home or something. I just worry about the process of those ballots from mailman to house, back to mailman to the county auditor, whoever does it. Um, it just seems to me like that's too important of a responsibility for a citizen to literally just mail in. Would you favor changing or being more restrictive on mail in voting? What do you think?
I think we can always look at it to ensure that integrity. I would say that the mail-in ballot has a purpose and has a good purpose. I was always kind of one of those, and I still do. I prefer to vote on the day of the election. And I've always enjoyed doing that. Um, but there are times I can't. I'm out of. I think I'm gone. I did go do in-person voting one time. My son was here, back from college. We went down to vote early, just in person. But my son's in New Orleans, and so going to school. So I think he's actually coming back and will be here to vote in person. But he would need a mail in. So at best, if we're going to limit this, now I'll step back. I did have a really good friend of mine back when we really need to say no mail-in voting, unless extreme situations. You're sick, you're going to be gone. Had a good friend of mine tell me that she always votes by mail-in ballot because she was at the time she was an ER nurse, and she was an on-call ER nurse. She never knew when she was going to have to be, at the hospital.
Right.
So, and that opened my mind a little bit to say, okay, I don't know all the situations and why someone does. I don't want to get so restrictive that people that then can't vote, because that is important. Um, there's a lot of reasons people go to say, okay, you can go do the mail-in or the in-person which is the mail-in process. It's just in person, and then restricting, exactly how much you can do the mail-in ballot. To me is something I'm willing to take a look at. But I don't want to get too crazy in restricting it that we are actually then hampering people that have legitimate reasons why they do mail-in ballot.
Yeah. All right. Taxes, spending, all the fun stuff. You guys, like it's just your fault. The Iowa legislature is spending more than $1 billion more than they're bringing in. You guys can do that because of the reserve funds, but obviously those are only there for so long.
Right.
So, what should the state be prepared to do once those reserve funds are no longer there? Do we raise taxes? Because that's how if you want to get increased revenue, it's got to come from somewhere. Or do we have to cut spending? I'm sure the answer is honestly probably somewhere in the middle and both. But what do you think is the reasonable expectation for Iowans? Because in a handful of years, if things don't change, we could be in big trouble.
Well, and I agree. And one of the things that a lot of people ask me about this, especially Democrats, why are we doing this? And you know, what essentially, I guess I'll illustrate with this. Back in 2005, I took a new job and uh, took a new job. I'd been working for Allied Insurance, started working for EMC Insurance, and I had to take a pay cut. And we had to rely, for a little bit on our savings account to make up some of that difference until we could figure some things out. That's kind of what the state did. I knew that the upside to that next job was going to be better pay. I had a higher upside to that. That is what we're trying to do. What we've done fiscally. We've put all this money away by probably taking in some more than what we should have been taking in. So we lowered the taxes, and we're going to rely on our savings account until our income bounces back. Good, in my opinion, good economic theory is you put more money back in taxpayers' pockets. They're going to spend it, and it's going to
Mhm.
actually generate more revenue. That has been historically what happens. Go back to Reagan times. The boom in that economy came from the lowering of taxes, um, and that led to the point where Clinton had a surplus, and that's what we're trying to get to. Saying that, obviously the economy has not bounced back quite like we had hoped. There's, I think, a lot of things at play in there. Um, but I think we will still see that upswing. As we get, I've been told, I was told by our fiscal people that we had up until the start of this year, um, we had about $14 billion that we have in reserves in different ways where we can make up that difference. And we still don't spend, we don't always spend all of what we're doing. Um, or all we're taking in. But it's at some point, yes, we will have to have that conversation. If the economy does not generate the revenue like we had anticipated, and I think it will, but we will have to get to the point where do we do tax cuts or do we do raise additional revenue? There are certainly ways we can raise additional revenue. What we did this year, just in my budget, we raised some filing fees in order to pay for a couple of programs, filing fees on court filings. Um, one of those programs was indigent defense. So we raised the filing fee on all of the court filings and put some of that money into indigent defense as opposed to general fund money. And so there's probably some ways we can find those types of revenue generators in order to if we get to that point, and I'm hoping we don't, and I don't think we will, um, where we can make up some differences in the budget.
Pretty positive outlook. for the most part.
Well, I gotta be.
Yeah, I don't know if you were there for all 34 hours because thankfully I wasn't. But you guys obviously finished the session trying to address property taxes. In my opinion, a bill like this, it's going to take some time before we really see the true impact of it and the true benefits and all that stuff. So all that said, what's left to be done, or what is some stuff that you think can be done on property taxes? And then you've been there for lowering the income tax. How low can they go with that?
Um, from a property tax standpoint, I think we're probably going to have to come back and take a look at some of those issues. We've already seen it. Polk City has put a moratorium in on using TIF. Pleasant Hill has as well. They're concerned about the impact of that bill and what that will do. So it's some of those issues I think we may still have to come back and address. Um, will it have the full impact? Um, from a One of the other things that we need to talk about, and we started to address it a little bit actually last year and this year as well, is insurance rates. That is, when we talk about property taxes, part of your property, your housing cost is insurance rates. We started that first time home buyer 529 plan through the property tax bill, which I thought was a wonderful it's a wonderful concept, and I'm hoping that will make a real impact on helping to probably lower the cost of housing, but also make housing more affordable to people. And it's one of the things, a similar concept with insurance rates. There's a couple of states that have it already. I learned about it a couple of years ago, brought it back to Iowa. Shannon Lundgren and Bobby Kaufman both were very supportive in filing a bill to create a flexible spending account type of account for insurance rates. Essentially, you put the money away like you would for medical costs, but you use it for deductibles and now also like maybe generators and things like that. And that so you can buy down your deductible. So that would help lower your insurance costs. You do those type couple of things, you really make an impact. Those are some of the things that we need to do from a taxation standpoint. That will obviously affect our bottom dollar as people are putting into these types of plans, but it will be a good thing in the end. Um, from an income tax standpoint, can we go lower? I think we can. We just have to be very, very careful about how we do that. Um, we've seen what happened. We lower it to, what is it? We're 3.8 now.
Yeah.
And so on a flat tax, which I agree with fully, but we also see that is obviously that's going to impact our revenue. We have to do it slowly, knowing that we have to wait for the revenue to bounce back. When I first got into in 2018, one of our first tax decreases that we did was the income tax decrease was tied to targets
Yeah.
and if in triggers, if you recall. And so that's something we probably need to relook at is like, if this happens, then this will happen. And, make sure that our income generates enough and then tie that to another reduction. But at the same time, we also have to make sure that we are spending appropriately. Fiscal responsibility isn't just about spending less. It's about ensuring that you can spend, that you are spending on the things that you need to spend on. There's what, 7 or 8 of us budget chairs, and I guarantee you there's at least 1 or 2 areas in each of our budgets saying we should have been spending a lot more money to begin with.
Yeah.
Two in my area, engine and defense, as well as judge pay. Those are 2 areas where we should have been spending more money, period.
Yeah. All right. So we're going to pivot from overall state budget and spending to the biggest driver of the state budget, education. Is it underfunded, or is the money just having to be spent? I shouldn't say having to be. I mean, you got Des Moines does dictate some of where they spend that money.
Mhm.
Um, but I just find it hard to believe that the state budget can be made up of the percentage of education spending it is, and that public education can be, quote, underfunded. So what do you think? Is it underfunded, or is the money just maybe could be better spent?
Um, Probably a little bit of both. Certainly with the inflation rates over the last few years, to only increase by, was it 2.25 last year, and I mean the year before, and then two this year. Yes, I think we're probably doing schools a disfavor. Even my schools, North Polk, Bondurant, Farrar, and Southeast Polk, three growing schools that do really good things with their money and are fiscally responsible, in my opinion. Even they're hurting a little bit just from the lack of increase that really has kept up with inflation. Um, but saying that, it's interesting. The Democrats have always talked about we've underfunded education, but they've never given us a number of what is fully funded. And I've talked about with Democrats about that a lot. It's like, okay, give me a number. Tell me exactly what that number looks like to fully fund it. When you look at how much we've continued to increase, and maybe we should have increased more than what we did, but was it 10 years of
Mhm.
10 plus years of constant increases, in school funding, not just the SSA amount, but transportation and other things. Um, that has added up to a significant amount of money. Um,
I'm
you
fairly
know,
certain the last time education spending was cut in Iowa, it was under Democrat leadership.
that is absolutely true. So, one of the things you always hate to do, you don't want to do that. You never want to overpromise and then underdeliver. And, so yes, maybe we've under promised a little bit, but we've certainly delivered.
Right.
Every year we've delivered an increase, and we've made that a priority. And it's, I will say the one area this year where I was vastly disappointed was that the Senate and the governor, um, just refused to move on additional funding for paraeducator pay. And we had put in $14 million a couple of years ago, fought like hell to get it last year again, fought like hell to at least get 7 of that 14 million this year, and couldn't get it done, which is very disappointing. But um, so to really answer your question, also, yes, there is probably still some areas where schools need to be a little more fiscally responsible. I mean, you look at the amount of administration that schools have.
Mhm.
Um, is that really needed? And I can't tell you. In some cases, probably, but in some cases, they need to take a hard look in the mirror and decide whether or not they need to spend so much money on the administrative side of things.
Right. Yep. ESAs, you mentioned that earlier. You voted against that. Your concern was strings being attached by the government going to Christian schools, private schools. So we get that. So at this point, um, are you comfortable with ESAs the way they are? Do you, you and I both know there's no guarantee that we have a Republican governor next year. Um, so are there reforms that you think need to be done, or would you support getting rid of the ESA program altogether?
Um, no, and I just turned up the volume, Jacob, just so you know, in case you hear a little beep. But um, make sure I can hear you. But it's, I think the ship has sailed. These are in place. Obviously, my concern is ties get put on this, and Christian schools, especially, are faced with the dilemma of, do we cave to whatever they want, or do we end the program? Or, in the event of a Democrat takeover of the trifecta, them just getting rid of it, getting rid of this program. And then what do these Christian schools do that have built up all this infrastructure, all the teachers, and all of the things? And then they have mass exodus because, the people can't afford to go there or don't want to go there unless they're getting that money. So no, at this point, I'm not sure there's reforms that I'd be supportive of. I certainly, one of the reasons I voted against that bill talking about the private colleges and the DEI offices was that's the kind of thing that I want to avoid ever having to vote about, um, when it comes to Christian schools. So I don't. It seems like the program is working. More people are using Christian schools. I don't really want to see it expanded either because of those same reasons. There's been talk about expanding it to homeschools and things like that. But even more so with homeschools, it's, then you really start, talking about strings, and because they're even less regulated uh, than Christian schools. So
Yep. Yep. We've done both in our family, so hmm, I know. Um, the so just to be clear, you wouldn't support getting rid of the program if Rob Sand won, and
yeah,
you would not join him in trying to, and I'm not saying he would, I'm not saying he wouldn't, but you would not support getting rid of the ESA program.
no, I don't. It's here, and I don't. Again, I don't want to cut that tap off because that's really going to hurt. I didn't wasn't really in favor of putting it in the first place for those reasons, but to try to change course now is really could be problematic for the Christian schools that are they're accepting these funds.
Yeah.
Um, so, but that was one of my worries when the bill was we were debating the bill was what's going to happen, in the future when Democrats
Yep.
take control.
Education wise, probably the biggest bill to pass in the last handful of years was Senate File 496, Parental Rights and Education Bill. Schools couldn't keep gender identity secrets, do the pronoun game with their students without letting mom and dad know. It restricted instruction on gender identity and sexual orientation for grades K through 6, and it got a lot of the sexually explicit materials out of school libraries. Um, you voted against that bill, so
No,
why
that one
don't
I
you
voted for. I believe I
Senate
voted
File
for it.
496?
I thought I voted for that one.
Okay. I can look, but we can talk about um, the just the move. Senate File 496. It passed the House 55-42. Um, I want to make sure that I'm accurate. And the other thing that sometimes happens, guys, if you're watching, is these bills get renumbered, these bills get amended, and they go back to the chamber. It's a lot of fun to monitor. But why don't we start and talk about the issue? We'll start and we'll talk about the issue that's present, and that's public libraries. As you know, in Bondurant,
Mhm.
you guys had this blow up with, I think it was a junior high book club at the public library, and they wanted to use the book, This Book is Gay.
Mhm.
If you guys aren't familiar with this, which most of you probably aren't, an entire chapter called The Ins and Outs of Gay Sex. And then I could go through a laundry list of other things. Tell me a little bit about that issue. Should a public library, a government institution, be providing access to children to sexually explicit content?
Um, you know, One of the things I didn't actually speak at either the forum that they had with the public, with the school board, and or with the or the city council. I didn't speak because I felt that was a local issue that the local people needed to weigh in on. So I let them weigh on, and I didn't want to lend my weight as a state representative. But as a local parent, one of the things that I would say is, you know, through time and material, through time immemorial, we have always, as a society, said there's certain materials that young people shouldn't have access to, be it sexually explicit or violence or whatever. That's why we have ratings on movies, etc. Um, that's why you just when you go into a public library and you don't see them checking out a librarian worth their salt would never allow them to check out a Playboy, assuming they even had them there. So it seems like common sense to me that there's a level of in society of libraries shouldn't allow people access, and accessing it and checking it out is different things. I mean, it's hard to police exactly where kids go in a library. I remember back
That's
to
fair,
my
yeah.
days, but checking out versus just going to see them. But no library would allow a student or a junior hire um, to check out an R-rated movie. So I'm not entirely sure why this library thought it was a good idea to include that particular book the way it's written on a list for junior hires. That is just common sense. That is just, it, it just boggles my mind that they thought that was appropriate to include on a list.
Mhm.
Parents obviously, we want to be mindful of the fact that, with parental rights, if they want their kid to have that book or look at that book, that's within their realm of reason. But they also should know what their kid is looking at and checking out in order to be able to monitor that. So I don't, again, these are a lot of local issues that in Bondurant we worked out locally, and
Yeah.
that's the way it should be. But um, we need to ensure that common sense is still prevailing within libraries, and it's unfortunate that sometimes it doesn't. But I'm
So
glad that.
would you support something that just said, now this gets, you're a lawyer, so you guys can complicate this one a lot. Uh, but would you support something that just said libraries cannot provide to a minor sexually explicit content? And I know that the argument's going to be every book in the library has literary value, so it's not obscene. Let's just grant them that. Um, but those passages that literally say "F me like you hate me," like that kids don't need that.
Right.
So
You
should a
know,
government be able to put in place a policy like, no, we're not going to provide that to kids?
I think there's the difficulty from a lawyer standpoint. The difficulty is trying to actually define that, and exactly how we define that in code. There was a couple of bills. Charlie Thompson had a bill in trying to define that. We tried, Skylar Wheeler had a bill or amended a bill. I think they were amended on both. It's on the same bill. That they try to define it the same way as we did in the school library bill about tying it to certain code. The real difficulty, especially when you talk about First Amendment issues as well, is how you really define what's sexually explicit, where is that line, and and it is very
Could
hard.
could you just take the language from 496 that you guys applied to public school libraries and apply it to public libraries? Same
I, I
kids, same government.
I think for two reasons. Um, one from a First Amendment standpoint, I think there's a slightly different First Amendment. There's going to be a different First Amendment argument. The First Amendment arguments in the school library, as the courts just ruled, are different, and there's more control there. The real problem, I think, um, with the school library and using that language is uh, it's missing a word. It's missing a word that the Senate refused to allow be put in, and that's called a graphic depiction. When you look at just a the way it was written was a depiction or visual depiction, I think a written depiction or visual depiction of a sex act as defined in a particular code section. It's a expansive reading, but in reading that is appropriate nonetheless. The Bible says in Genesis, Abraham knew his wife. Well, that is a depiction of a sex act. And it's people are going to say, well, that's just not what's intended. No, it's not. That is definitely not what's intended. But by a strict and literal reading of that code section, that's what that would entail, and that's not what's intended at all. We're trying to get to graphic depictions. We actually proposed that, I think, in an amendment in on that bill, and the Senate wouldn't take the word graphic, and I think just that word would make things a little bit because he can't say Adam knew Eve is a graphic depiction of a sex act.
Yeah.
But to say Adam knew Eve is a description technically of a sex act. That's where the vagaries of the language, this becomes incredibly hard to define.
Yeah. All right. So I multitask, which anybody that knows men knows it's dangerous, but I did it nonetheless. We were both right. On April 3rd, you voted against, April 4th, 2023, you voted against Senate File 496. April 20th, you voted for it. So, as I had said, the Senate obviously amended it. Um, if you can't recall the reasons that you had, you can't recall them. But
Wait,
if
what
you
year was
do,
that?
it was 2023.
2023. Yeah, 3 years ago. Yeah, I don't remember exactly what changed and what the difference was. I do my best to try to read the bills very thoroughly, um, and you know understand what they do. There must have been something in our particular bill that I had some issues with. And obviously when you group all of that stuff together, sometimes there may be one part of that that I just couldn't swallow. But maybe that got amended to a in a way that made it acceptable. So, and I
Yeah.
don't remember all the specifics
And
on
I'm not going to pretend to remember how it was amended either.
that.
Um, but I do know, um, we can talk about, I mean, we may as well just address it and let the people have their fun. You can talk a little bit about the bathroom bill. You can talk about the bill that protects kids from sex changes. Both of these bills that you voted against. And if you want to, I hope they weren't amended and we're both right, whatever. Also, the effort to remove gender identity from the Civil Rights Code. Um, just talk about those votes and let's
Yeah.
just get this part of the conversation over with.
Yeah, I mean, so let's just start with the bathroom bill. Actually, the bathroom bill I thought was a really good approach, constitutionally, in its concept, um, and it had every intention to vote for that bill because I fully agree. Men shouldn't be in women's bathrooms and women shouldn't be in men's bathrooms, not only for the safety but also the comfort of the people that are in there. I don't want a woman in my bathroom. It makes me feel uncomfortable because I'm a gentleman. But the morning of that bill running, I met a person named Bob. Now, yeah, I'm. You're the only one probably who's going to understand this, Jacob. But you know who Taylor Rager is. Um, Walked into the house lounge to meet with Bob. Bob looked a lot like Taylor Rager. As a matter of fact, for a half a second, I'm like, "Why is Taylor here?" Bob is a biological female. Full beard. I mean, literally, looks like Taylor a little bit. That full beard, that nice hair. Probably a little thinner than Taylor, but still, look, Bob is a biological female. If you recall what that bathroom bill did, it was say that uh, you have to use in schools, you have to use the bathroom of your biological sex. And students could ask for an accommodation, saying, can I use a single stall? But that was students. Okay. Bob, being an adult who actually had children, um, Bob would not be allowed by that bill to ask for an accommodation. Okay. So when hadn't even caught that. I'd read the bill a number of times. Hadn't even caught that. But we were going to be forcing Bob, who was a biological female, but looked like a man, better beard than you can grow, Jacob. And
That's not saying a whole lot,
but
unfortunately.
we're going to be forcing him, Bob, and I say Bob, we were forcing Bob, looking like a man, into a female bathroom. Now, practically, yeah, you probably could just walk into a men's room, have no concern. But if someone knew that Bob was a biological female and decided they didn't really like him, they could have him arrested. So for doing that, I think I can't remember what the penalty was, for doing that, but whatever the penalty was, Bob would be subjected to that.
Mhm.
So that was a hole the size of a Mack truck to me in that hole, in that bill. I went to Steve Holt. I said, Steve, this is a problem. And Steve goes, I know. I know it's a problem. I've talked to the governor. I've talked to the Senate about it, but they won't do anything about it. I'm like, it's such an easy fix. We just apply that right to an accommodation to everyone and, allow Bob to use a single stall. And now, practically, my guess is the school would do that, but there's no requirement to do it. So to me, that was such a hole that I just couldn't support the bill as written. Um, the transgender bill, this is, again, took me a long time to read that bill, to understand what that bill was. Essentially, there's three parts. I'll get to the part that really was problematic to me. Again, as a constitutional person who believes in the Constitution, the middle part of that bill dealt with birth certificates. So let's take Bob for an example. Bob is an Iowan. Bob was born in Iowa, has a birth certificate in Iowa that says, he's a female at birth. Bob can't change that to be a male. As a birth certificate say that he's a male under this law. However, let's say Amy Wichtendahl, and you know who Amy is, representative from out east, eastern Iowa. Amy is a biological male. Let's say, for example, she was born in New York, and Amy, she's gone through the transition surgery. She can go to New York and have her birth certificate changed. Now, why is this important, and where does the Constitution come in? Birth certificates are used to get travel documents and different things. And oftentimes you need to appear as what you are stated as on your birth certificate. Well, we've now set up under that bill, in my opinion, an unconstitutional equal protection problem, because people born in Iowa who go through the transition surgery do not have the same right to change their birth certificate as people who are living in Iowa but have been born outside of Iowa, and allow them to do that under their state and the state law where they were born. So that is, I think, like I said, there are three problems. I have some issues with all three problems, or with all three sections, but from a constitutional standpoint, again, I took an oath to defend the Constitution, the state of Iowa and the United States. If something violates the Equal Protection Clause, I can't vote for it. So,
How do you, just curiosity, how do you see the ability to provide protections based on sex while at the same time providing protections based on gender identity?
well, if you ask the U.S. Supreme Court, they're apparently the same thing, at least in the limited area of where was it, employment, I think is what they said. Um, you know, Growing up, gender and sex were the same thing. And I don't know exactly when we started changing that, where sex and gender were different, until we really started saying, well, I guess it happened. I'm not sure when it happened, to be honest.
Basically, Barack Obama, North Carolina, 2008-ish.
But, so, I mean, I don't know why it's really a thing. And I really, again, going back to the U.S. Supreme Court case where they basically said those are the same thing. Gender identity and sex are the same thing. I do question, from a constitutional standpoint, are we going to get to the point, even under our own Supreme Court, where they apply that same analysis all across the board, and we're just going to come back to the same questions? One of the other concerns about that is, when the Democrats take control, they're just going to put it right back in. And when they put it in, what else are they going to do? Just out of retaliation, could they say, okay, you talked about immutable characteristics. We believe gender identity is a mutable characteristic, just like race, which I don't agree with, but they could say that. And what the other thing that is in that list is truly not an immutable characteristic is religion. So
Mhm.
could they make an attempt to remove religion out of the civil rights code? And then where are we at? So, the long-term implications of this is, to me, is concerning. So,
Yep.
yeah. Now the surgery bill, I will tell you that, you know, that was 24 hours of some of the hardest things of my life. I don't agree that a parent who is going to be a good parent are making those decisions for those kids. You know, I will admit I've never had to go through that decision with my kids. I've never been faced with that kind of decision. I don't know. I think I know how I would react, but it would be tough. Um, I, I went through a kid who went through drug addiction. It's hard to make decisions, in those moments, and all you want is the best for your kid, no matter what. And so it's hard. One of the things that it seemed to me that, and this is what I said on the floor, if we're going to say we believe in parental rights and the parents have the right to make the decisions for their kid, we have to allow them to make decisions we don't even agree with. So what's interesting, or what I find interesting, is apparently Trump believes that too. Trump's on my side on that issue, because in the Save Act, uh, the they ban, part of the Save Act is to ban transgender surgeries, but there is an express exception if the parent expressly agrees to the surgery. So I find that I was surprised to see that, um, but it's, again, getting back to limited government, getting back to, constitutionality of things. Parents have constitutional rights to do what they need to with their children, and just because I disagree with what they may do doesn't give me the right to say no. You know,
Yeah. Um, let's see. I think that's all pretty interesting. Right now, I'm trying to find, I just found it. Um, the the bill in 2019 to ban female genital mutilation. Um, you voted for that. How
yes.
is that how is that different? Like if the parent if how's that different in the parental rights world?
Um, that that bill came out through, with gender mutilation. That was a cultural practice. That wasn't really driven by necessarily by parents. That was driven by, the culture. And I guess, as I'm saying it, maybe there's some similarities there. And again, this is one of the reasons where this was one of the most difficult decisions that I've made. And it was painstaking, to think through, and to try to reconcile, with things. It's, um, yeah, I guess I don't have the best answer to that, Jacob. Sometimes, you're in the moment of things, and as you
Well, let's just
in
let's just
2019, I was a freshman too. So,
yeah. Well,
it's
it was my first year down there too. Would
yeah.
you vote the same way? I mean, if it came up today,
The gender
everything we've
mutilation.
learned, yeah, I mean everything we've learned, because let's be honest, we're learning about the effects of this also rapidly. And this is a practice that's been banned in other countries in Europe now.
Right.
So let's just say it came up again. Would you vote the same way?
Um, I think that's heavily dependent on the language, in the bill. Let's start with that. It was it depends on it. You know, it depends on. It's a good question.
Every once in a while, I get one of those off.
Yeah, no, that's and it's a fair question. Would I vote? How would I vote? Again, let's
Well,
see.
let's just flip it. Rob Sands governor.
Hmm.
Um, you have razor thin majorities because I don't think anybody thinks Democrats are taking over, and they want to reverse the law. However, they do that through the legislative practice. Would you vote in favor of allowing children to undergo sex change surgeries?
Um, Again, I think if under the parameters that I talked about when I talked about it on the floor, one of the things that I heard was, you know, let's ban it. I have no problems banning it, but as even in the Save Act, if there's an exception for parents, if there's an exception for, you know, one of the things that I heard, and this is one of the things I have to still flush out, um, because I didn't hear a lot. I heard about it, but I didn't completely understand it. Was that once you start down puberty blockers, if you stop them, it can cause medical issues. Um, that's one issue that I admit I was concerned about. I would admit I didn't get full information on, but it concerned me enough that that was another reason that I voted against the bill. If we're talking about something like that's in the Save Act, that let's flush out the puberty blockers, whether or not they actually cause harm, then yeah, I could have voted for that, and I would have voted for that with those exceptions in there. Um, and because again, I don't generally this is a practice that shouldn't happen. And the medical society, clearly, the medical community is finally and rightfully changing their tune on this. This shouldn't even be an option for parent given to parents as a as a as a cure. That's not the right word, but as a
Treatment.
treatment. Yeah. So
All right. Well, that's an answer. We're gonna pivot to abortion, and I know that you care a lot about the adoption issue. I don't know if as many people realize that. But you have a very unique, if I'm remembering correctly, I think it was a Judiciary Committee meeting. I can't remember for sure, but you have a very kind of unique view on when life begins. Currently, Iowa protects unborn babies from the moment there's a fetal heartbeat detected. When do you believe life begins, and should Iowa provide protections earlier than it does than at heartbeat?
yeah, I'm and this is good. This one I'm glad we're have a little more time to explain. You know, and my my personal opinion and my view in reading the Bible is that life probably begins not at conception, but when blood becomes in the body. And how I got there, just so everyone explains where I got. I'm not just plucking this out of thin air. Um, a couple of things into this. Number one, I've always I'm grew up as a Bible believing independent Baptist, KGV only Baptist. Um, and one of the things that I've been taught and do believe is to be absent with the body from the body is to be present with the Lord. So when you die, your soul goes to heaven, your body stays here until such time as the rapture. So when we're talking about when really life begins, to me the question becomes when does the soul inhabit the body? Because until the time the body has a soul, there's really nothing to go to heaven, right? So it's the real question then becomes when does that happen? Now, when we think about science too, half of all fertilized eggs do not attach to the uterus. The female body simply, expels them, and that particular embryo, I don't, goes away. If we think about when I think about life beginning at conception, and half of all fertilized eggs, that's what happens to them. That is a lot. Can't even wrap my mind around that number throughout history. And if all of those discarded fertilized eggs, uh, you know, had a soul, what does that mean? when we get to heaven. I don't know. That's where it gives me a little pause. Um, so I question then, so when does that exactly happen? That, life really begins. And I get to, in throughout the New Testament, or excuse me, the Old Testament, um, it says that the life is in the blood. That when blood is shed and blood is absent from the body, there's no longer life. Kind of like the idea of the fetal heartbeat. There's no heartbeat, there's no life. Um, so, to me, that tells me that may be when life begins. So that is somewhere between week 1 or 1 week after to 3 weeks after fertilization, based on things that I've read from a scientific standpoint. Um, you know, People use a couple of different verses to talk about life at conception. It's with David and Jeremiah and Isaiah talking about, God knew you before you were in the womb, and God knit you together when you're in the womb. To me, those have always been persuasive in when actually life begins, because God is both omniscient and omnipotent. So, God obviously knows you before you were long. He knew who I was long before I was ever conceived. That didn't make me alive. And not to start a Calvinist debate here, but it's, it's Romans 8:29. Paul says that God foreknew us, those who are predestined. I mean, now in my faith tradition, that means God knows who's going to get saved, but the work of salvation still has to happen. So the fact that God and David and Jeremiah are saying God knew who you were, knew you even in the womb, doesn't necessarily mean that the work of life began at that moment. Just like salvation didn't happen at the moment God foreknew you. So, to me, I guess I'm not fully settled on this. You know, it's just like, so many people are so sure about life at conception, and I guess I'm not sold on that either. It's just, would never call them not a Christian for someone who believes that. I, I'm not saying they're wrong either.
Is it possible that life begins at conception?
Oh, very possible. I fully
So
acknowledge
if it's
it's quite
possible,
possible.
wouldn't it make sense to protect it from the earliest moment it's possible?
I think, and I've always said I would default to that.
Yeah.
Um, but when it comes down to some of the legislation, particularly
Right.
legislation about, from a civil standpoint, that life beginning conception, what that could do to IVF
Mhm.
industry, is particularly concerning. So the practical application of that sometimes has, I have some questions about what that practically can mean.
And
Uh,
again, in terms of President Trump and the direction of the Republican Party under his leadership, he's very pro IVF,
mhm,
regardless of how we feel about it.
right.
He's very much a supporter of IVF, and I think the party as a whole, which we've seen in the legislature just this year, by no means is settled on whether it wants to legislate life at conception, which I don't know where else you go between heartbeat and conception. I mean, I guess your position would be the only other possibility that I've ever heard of between conception and heartbeat. Um, so legislatively, would you be open to moving things up earlier than heartbeat?
Yeah, based on my belief, I would certainly, going down to 2 or 3 weeks, when blood starts, that would be, I would be remiss not doing that based on my belief. If I didn't, then I'd probably call me a hypocrite. I'm comfortable with heartbeat. I'd be more comfortable with something else. I'm just not comfortable yet to say all the way to life of conception.
Yeah.
Um, for several reasons, including the practical implications to IVF.
Tell me a little bit about your positions on medical freedom. That's been a big issue since you've been in the legislature. Because again, we're not seeing dead people. We both survived COVID, and
I
we
don't think
lived
I've ever
under
had it. So strangely.
we've li we've lived under some really unique circumstances. And there's been some bills that addressed vaccination requirements at colleges, or having to inform people about the exemptions that exist. Tell me a little bit about where you are on the medical freedom issue, vaccines, that sort of thing.
Well, I live with a nurse, so it's she sees the value of vaccines. Um, this is a hard topic. I mean, when you look back at the COVID vaccine and some of the discussions around that, there's some merit. I mean, you look at, and I'm no big fan of Aaron Rodgers, so don't even think I'm trying to espouse a Green Bay Packer ever. Um, but one of the things that he said and why he rejected the COVID is like, my vaccine is the things that I put in my body are between me and my doctor, and I generally agree with that concept. The difficulty in especially vaccines, early childhood vaccines, and this is where I get an earful from my wife all the time, is you know by requiring them, we are ensuring that they get them, and there is some real validity to having, at least getting them into the doctor to say, have that conversation. She worked in a um, uh, pediatric clinic for many years, and she knows that if people weren't required to get in and get their children vaccinated against things like polio and the mumps and the measles and all of
MMR, yeah.
those things, then they simply wouldn't come in and do it. And then what do we have? So there's some legitimacy to some of these requirements. Um, I think when we get into adulthood, um, that is a for ourselves, and there's should I be made to get the shingles vaccine? Um, you know, Although it's not contagious, so I'm not sure. Probably not the best example. That should be between me and my doctor, definitely. It's just the difficulty becomes, especially in childhood vaccines, is ensuring that they get them, and we are protecting the greater good and the greater whole of other
So how
youths.
does that comport with the vote and the position that a parent should be able to decide if their kid has a sex change?
It's again, I think the sex change is an individual issue. You can't, sexuality isn't contagious. MMR and mumps and measles and polio is, from a public health standpoint. I think that's where there's a dichotomy there that, now having the requirements that, ensuring that they know about the exemptions, um, that they're there, um, that they really should, uh, you know, be able to make that decision whether or not they should be exempted. So
Okay. Um, you guys address governor's emergency powers, and I think you could probably do even a little bit more. So we don't really have
I
to
wish
talk
we
about,
would have,
yeah.
that needed to be, and I've said this since 2020. Um, that whole process, the current, I wrote an article about this
Yep.
year, you know, the it's the governor's powers laws are not built for a long-term medical emergency, or public health emergency. It's just not. We needed to address this issue a long time ago, and actually, you know, write the statute in a way. Now that we know there's this other issue out here, the current public health emergency are
Antivirus or whatever it is.
it's really built for short-term public health outbreaks, not for long-term public health outbreaks. So how do we reconcile that, and how do we actually build a code that addresses those situations? and in my mind probably gives much more legislative oversight in power in that. And we should have gone further, and we should have had it been much more comprehensive in that regard, a comprehensive review, and we should have done that in 2020, quite honestly.
Yeah. Not a lot of
Well,
pushback from
2021, I should say.
now your district isn't the most rural district in the Iowa House, so I'm not sure, but I do think, am I wrong in thinking you guys might have some data centers?
Um, Technically, Facebook is not in my district.
Okay.
So
Well,
technically, I mean,
there is a lot of conversation among grassroots conservative Republican Iowans about data centers and wind turbines, especially in rural parts of the state. What do you think in terms of wind turbines, data centers? Are those benefits to the state, or should we really look at trying to do better at limiting where those are?
um, there's a bill that was floated around this year, but renewable siting, basically to not say local governments can't regulate, but it kind of makes sure that we are doing what we can to expand our uh, renewable energy or our energy needs. Period. We're going to need more energy. We need an all above approach. That is windmills and you name it, windmills, solar, nuclear, all of those things. Um, Not only to support hopefully an expanding business environment, but also an expanding residential environment and all of those things. We are obviously a unique weather state in that we have all kinds of challenges that way. Um, we need to make sure we have a sustainable and reliable and growable energy supply. Data centers challenge that, especially from a energy standpoint. Um, they are huge, and like I said, Facebook is just, I mean, it's in Bondurant School District, although it's technically in uh, Altoona city limits, which is not my district. Um, 10 of them, huge power supply. Now, they don't use as much water as everybody thinks they do. There is an initial supply of water. As a matter of fact, my son's father-in-law works for Baker Group, and he was telling me that the systems they're building now, they're closed loop systems. Once they fill them with water, unless there's some sort of leak, they they will never use another other than bathrooms and water faucets. They don't use water normally. So we need to make sure we're mindful of where they're at, to ensure that there is a sufficient water supply, but to get them up and running. The energy standpoint, we need to ensure that they're not really drawing so much power that it's increasing the cost to other people, to ensure that, in my opinion, what we're doing with the Dwayne Arnold uh, nuclear power plant out east, essentially that is going to be 90% of that power that is generated will go to the Google data center that's being built there. Excuse me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I would like to see us be able to replicate that. And we have a bill to, we passed a bill this year to provide for um, nuclear generation tax credits, and we need to replicate that kind of model around all the data centers. Where AI is going to drive the economy in the future. It's going to be a good thing. It's just one of those. We've started planning for it. We need to follow through, and having more data centers is going to be a good thing because it's going to provide better AI, which is going to improve everybody's lives. One example that I just heard about the other day, I believe it's United Healthcare is using AI in their pre-authorization process, which will uh, streamline the pre-authorization process or eliminate the pre-auth process in certain circumstances, lowering the overall cost of healthcare to some degree. AI is going to help. There's going to be bad things about it as well, but in the end, it's a technology we cannot get behind on, because if we do, we're going to lose.
Now you're an incumbent, so I will ask you this. There's some stuff I'm just going to skip over. And I think we could have a much larger, broader discussion about the transparency and government accountability thing, especially with you, because of your background. But you've mentioned your appreciation for President Ronald Reagan. Most dangerous words in the English language. I'm from the government and I'm here to help.
Right.
Well, the government in Iowa is set out to try to find ways to um, limit or reverse the rise in cancer in the state of Iowa. How on earth can the government try and reverse this cancer trend in Iowa? Not no offense to you as part of the government, but I'm a little skeptical that you guys are going to come up with the answers to solve this one.
Well, we probably aren't. Government, any answer generally we come up with is probably the wrong one and only leads to more problems. What we can do is invest in areas that can be helpful, invest in industries that can be helpful. So we invested in childhood cancer research. We're going to let others do the research. Obviously, the government's not going to do the research, but we're going to help fund it. Water quality, we can help with incentivizing local farmers to make decisions that they have to make, in terms of buffers and bioreactors and all of those things, wetlands. We can be a part of the solution, I believe. But that has to be guided as much by it's more of an investment into things and allowing the private sector to really drive the where the answers are, find those answers, and then us helping to ensure that those get enacted.
Yeah. I really, it's not funny, so I don't laugh. But whenever I hear the governor candidates talk about the cancer, I just think, good luck, guys.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know how you're going to do this, and I don't know how you can promise to try and work toward it, but gall darn it, good luck. More power to you.
Well, they got to make
Um,
campaign promises, and but yeah, it's that's why I don't talk a lot on the campaign trail.
well,
It's
I mean, it's just, well, it is different for them because they're one of one. You're one of 100. So you need a little bit more consensus than what they're going to need. Um, let's see some of these better ones here towards the end. Can you think of an issue, and I bet you can, where you've kind of had to push back against leadership, or maybe the party as a whole wanted to go with it, and you said, "Sorry, guys, it's not me." And I think this is a good place to highlight we've gone through your voting record quite a bit, and there's a lot of things that I would never agree with in your voting record, but there's also a couple things where we align pretty well on, whether it's the tort reform that they did or allowing your trash to be seized by law enforcement as soon as you put it on the curb. I mean, you do have some, I guess I'd call it out of the box thinking compared to other legislators, but issues where you've had to kind of stand up to leadership and just separate yourself.
Well, you mentioned tort reform, and that was one of the things that, again, I'm a lawyer, but more importantly, I believe in the Constitution and I believe in the right to a jury trial. And I always saw that the tort reform, the medical malpractice tort reform, limiting the damages of someone who's harmed by a doctor has been one of those things that, to me, takes the issue out of the hands of the jury, and that is a constitutional right. So that was done in both the medical malpractice realm as well as the trucker tort reform bill that limited the damages by trucking companies. Um, you know, I for a couple of years, several years, I we stood up. There was a group of us, and led by by myself as well as Dustin Height, that pushed back again and pushed back hard against the leadership and the rest of my caucus that wanted these things. Now I lost on both of those issues. Eventually, those passed, and I actually, honestly, and I don't know if you caught this, but I did vote for the trucker reform bill after the parties came together, and this is what I told my caucus, is like, I fought against this for 2 or 3 years, but the parties finally came together. They found a compromise that both sides could live with, and that to me was, I still hated taking the vote, but the fact that they were able to compromise and find a solution that both were acceptable with. I was told I didn't have to vote for it, but I'm like, no, if you guys are going to do the work, I'm going to support that. So I still don't like it, but it was one that I ended up voting for. But that is an issue that we did push back again. I pushed back hard. Then you mentioned the garbage. That to me was so crazy. That our Supreme Court said that you had a reasonable expectation of garbage in your garbage once you put it on the curb, and police couldn't then file through it. That was black letter law when I was in law school. That once it's on a curb, you have no reasonable expectation of privacy in it. So for our Supreme Court to flip that on its head, I was shocked. Um, so it's a constitutional issue. I was then shocked that we would run a bill that said, no, you have a reasonable expectation of privacy. I'm like, no, you can't do that in a statute. You have to do that in a constitutional amendment. Apparently, I was wrong, because we did eventually pass that bill and put it in the Iowa Code that you have a reasonable expectation, or you don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy. And the Supreme Court agreed with that. I'm like, I don't know what was going on. So, yeah, it's sometimes you get into some crazy issues.
Yeah, it was an interesting conversation during those days. I'm assuming I know where you're at on the pesticide liability thing, but I guess that's kind of the current battle that you guys are waging in terms of that portion of law.
Yeah, the pesticide bill, again, it comes down to, well, a couple of different things. For me, is one, it's, you know people need to have their ability to get to a jury, or at least their ability to have their day in court to try to prove that. Again, the plaintiffs still have to prove causation. I mean, that this pesticide actually caused their cancer. It's not an easy road to do, but they shouldn't have that just cut off. The other thing that concerns me about that bill is where they're saying that um, if the government okays the language on their warning, then they're immune from liability for that. And I've used the example so many times. Jacob, do you know when asbestos was banned by the federal government?
No idea.
About 3 years ago.
Hmm.
The government doesn't move fast. We're not known for our speed. So to say, okay, if the government approved this warning on a Roundup bottle, and circumstances have changed on until that label is actually changed to reflect those new facts or findings, they're still immune, and that's part of that bill. So that's something that like, there's just no way I can support a bill that you know where the government is basically in charge of deciding what's good language and what's not. So
Yeah.
because things could change tomorrow, and it would be 3 or 4 years or 30 years before they actually approve changes in the language.
All right. If the voters remember one thing about your campaign, what do you want it to be?
I think one thing I want them to remember is, I'm a hardworking guy. My dad was a janitor for 27 years, went to work every day, put his head down, and he worked. Wasn't there for the fanfare, wasn't there for, to talk about himself. I don't talk about myself a lot, and it's kind of hard for me to do. But since I've been in the legislature now 8 years, I go to work every day. I work hard. I try to make the best decisions that I can based on the information I can, based on what the Constitution says. I don't always get it right, I will admit. But it's it's led to really good results. I've gotten results. I haven't been focused on rhetoric. In the 89th and the 90th General Assemblies, the Center for uh, um, Effective Lawmaking, through the Vanderbilt University, I've been the most effective legislator in the entire General Assembly, and I've been able to get results for issues that really matter to Iowans, including abortion, or not abortion, on adoption. I filed 9 bills now dealing with adoption. 6 of them have gotten to the governor. So um, I've been effective. I've been recognized as effective, and I'm about the work. So
Yeah. All right. If people want to learn more, again, if you guys don't live in District 45, you can still help and get involved, whether it's donations, letters to the editor, making phone calls from home, going to the district to knock. Whichever candidate you like the best in this race, you guys can do that because there's 125 legislative races in this state. I think 22 of them maybe have a Republican primary. So this is your chance to really kind of put your thumb on the scales. If they want to learn more about your campaign, they can go where?
they can go to my Facebook page. They can go to my website, Brian four with a four Iowa.com. Certainly, my email is on my website and my Facebook. Always feel free to either reach out by phone or by email.
All right. Representative Lohse, I appreciate your time. It was a lot
It was a
of
lot. So I hope you're not
time.
late for your baseball game.
I will it's just practice tonight. I would
Okay.
not be late for a game. Um, but it was a lot of actually quite interesting, and hopefully people learn some stuff and they are going to be better voters because of it. I appreciate your time. Thanks a lot, you guys, for watching. Feel free to like and share and comment. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.